So anyway, as I said today, we'll finish Plato. That'll be really quick at the beginning of class, and we'll spend the majority of the time getting a good start on Aristotle and the chapter on Aristotle from the textbook. We're not going to do the whole chapter like we did for Plato. We'll end, we'll skip that last section, his theory of music. Um, Besides that, let's see, the paper. I'm thinking, well, we'll see how long it takes us to get through Aristotle, but I think we'll probably be able to finish him next week. And so the paper, I'm thinking we do 2 weeks from today, and I'll post the topics either before or after class next weekend. So that's how that's going to work. And there'll be, I don't know, I forget, I think there's 3 or 4 topics that I'm going to post for Aristotle and Plato, and you can pick one. And if you have your own idea for your own topic, that's fine as well. Just make sure you, run it by me real quick first. So let's see, we'll have 1 week to do the paper. Yes, exactly. You'll have about a week to do the paper. Yeah. Okay, let's see. Anybody else have any other questions? Paper isn't due on the 4th. No, I guess not. Yeah, I guess we're behind schedule. Is that what the syllabus says? I guess. Yeah, I figured that would happen. If the syllabus or maybe Blackboard has it as the 4th, I'm not sure. Well, what is the date? Let me see. I've got a calendar right here. I guess that would be, if today is the 26th, next Saturday is the 3rd. Yeah, I guess I can make it do like that Sunday or something like that, Sunday at midnight, which would be like the 11th. So pretty close to the 5th, but yeah, I guess you get a little bit extra time for that. That'll be that. Anybody got any questions about that before I dive into the lecture and kind of talk a little bit about Plato before moving on to Aristotle? Doesn't look like anybody has any questions, so let me share my screen as usual. Let's get back to the, oh wait, I see somebody sent me a private message. I don't know if this is.
Sorry, it's just about my Zoom. I'm logged into something random. I was just letting you know it's me.
Oh, okay. Well, I can see your name, so that's fine. You know, as long as it's your, yeah, as long as you have the same username, I'll be able to tell who's here and who's not.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so again, let me get to the Plato. There's only really 2 slides we didn't cover last time, and we actually talked about the allegory of the cave before, so I won't spend too much time on this. It'll be pretty brief. But let's actually revisit this this quote from the end of the chapter. For some reason there's a delay. Okay, finally it's kind of catching up here. So this quote, right? We've talked a bit, in fact, I guess most of the class last time was devoted to a lot of metaphysics. We were talking about Plato's theory of forms, this idea that, there's somehow a form of bed, and every particular bed is based off this archetype or this perfect blueprint in Plato's heaven. And, since this is a course in the philosophy of art and the philosophy of beauty, aesthetics, of course, we have this famous passage in your textbook from the Symposium where we get a description of beauty. What is beauty itself? And I mentioned this last time. I'll say it again. This is, believe it or not, one of the most clear, one of the most lucid descriptions of a form that you're going to find in Plato. He's not very clear about what forms are. In fact, he's pretty clear that you can't really talk about them in a sort of certain sense. They're just ideas that you just know or understand, and when you try to put them in words, words themselves kind of escape, the essential meaning. So that lends itself to sort of this sort of mystical interpretation. In fact, this passage doesn't help much if you don't want to read it as a mystic. It almost sounds like when we see the beautiful, it's this sort of mystical experience. And we talked about last class, and I rushed through this at the end. That's why I'm kind of revisiting a little bit. From Plato's Symposium, he's talking to Diotima, and she tells him how to approach beauty correctly, how to do, and it all has to do with the proper form of love, a big, I wouldn't say a big portion of a large portion of the dialogue symposium. This is debatable. Is about love. Some say that's just the surface. It's got much deeper meanings in that. There's a lot of layers to the symposium, and part of it is love for sure, right? What is eros? What is this desire that we have for others? And towards the end of the dialogue, we get to what true love is, and that's the love of wisdom, which is philosophy. And the true lover is the one that takes this journey to true beauty, right? Love is always love of beauty. We love what we find beautiful. We're drawn towards the beautiful. And so what is real beauty? That's the aim, the highest aim. True beauty is the highest aim of love. So again, I'll reread this passage to just sort of get us started, and then try to wrap things up with Plato, if I can, as quickly as possible. I'd like to get to Aristotle. I know we're way behind. So again, this is from your textbook, page 76. He who has been instructed thus far in the things of love, and who has learned to see the beautiful in due order and succession. And we'll talk about this. We did this last time, but we'll recap what that means. How do we learn to see beauty in the right order and succession? We'll come back to that. So when he comes towards the end, we'll suddenly perceive a nature of wondrous beauty, a nature which in the first place is everlasting, not growing or decaying or waxing or waning. So the first point that Diotima makes to Socrates is that this beauty she speaks of, the beautiful itself, absolute beauty, the form of beauty, this is not changing. It's everlasting, not growing or decaying, neither waxing nor waning, unlike the beauty we see in physical forms, the beauty that we see in the world. That beauty is always fading, okay, according to the argument here. The second, it's not fair in one point of view and foul in another, right? Foul in another time or relation, or at another place foul, as if fair for some and foul to others, or in the likeness of the face or hands or any other part of the bodily frame. So it's not beautiful from a certain angle. It's not beautiful if you look at it from this side. It's not beautiful on Monday but ugly on Tuesday, right? It's not beautiful for one person and ugly for another, depending on your taste. It is just what's beautiful, the concept beauty, the beautiful itself. And it's not a physical thing. So he says it's not in the likeness of it's not like your face, like a pretty face. The beautiful itself is not something that's visual in a certain sense. It's not in the likeness of face or hands or any other part of the body or in any form of speech. So even, speaking, that's not the beauty he's speaking of here, or she, I guess. It's Diotima who's doing the talking here in this passage. And it's not in a body, for example, in an animal, or even in heaven or earth. So these forms that Plato speaks of, beautiful itself, the good itself, the chairness itself, deskness, stuff we talked about last week, those aren't located in time and space. What's true of chairs, what's true of being a chair is always true. Just like what's true of being a circle is always true. It's always 360 degrees, even though physical circles, a circle that I might draw on the chalkboard can be erased, can be smudged. A circle that's in a textbook, for one, it's not a perfect circle. It's not exactly 360 degrees. There are no perfect circles in the physical universe. So it's not even a circle, if you want to get super nitpicky. But even if it were, forget all that. Even if it were, it fades, it's physical. But this, the idea of circle doesn't change, doesn't fade, always the same. Same goes for beauty. Okay, so it's outside of time and space, and it's not in some place. But beauty absolute, separate, simple, everlasting, which without diminution, and without increase, it doesn't get smaller or bigger. Without any changes, it's imparted to ever-growing and perishing beauty of all other things. So it itself doesn't lose in beauty, yet it imparts beauty on all that is beautiful. In a sense, everything is beautiful because Plato uses different language for this. Things are beautiful because they share in the beauty, because they participate in the beautiful, because they resemble the absolute beautiful, that there's some likeness to the beautiful itself. So all things that are beautiful owe their beauty to beauty itself. And yet it doesn't depend on anything else. It is independent and separate from all that that we see in this physical, visible realm. This lower realm for Plato, which is a copy or a shadow of this higher ideal realm of forms. So I said I would come back. And by the way, if anybody wants to jump in here, I'm kind of running through this quickly because I felt like we spent a whole lot of time last week on this stuff. But if anybody has any questions or comments, don't be shy. Feel free to jump in. I should open my chat box too. I got that closed. So let me see. Click on that chat box. But I said I would come back to this point about learning to see the beautiful in due order and succession. Um, I had this little chart, little table that I made. Um, and yeah, so this is, I think I actually read the quote where I'm extrapolating most of this from. I read this last week towards the end of class. Diotima is telling Socrates how he is to proceed properly if he's going to have this vision of the beautiful, if he's going to understand the beauty itself. And she says he has to start in his youth with a sort of a vulgar conception of the beautiful, with one particular beautiful body. Maybe your first crush would be like the beginning of this journey upwards towards absolute beauty. And so you have your first crush here. This is the low, like that. If you remember back to the allegory of the cave, this would be analogous to being in the cave and looking at the shadows. Okay, so the shadows, they look similar to the things that they're shadows of, but they're just an appearance. They're not real in this absolute sense. And so that's the kind of beauty you're going to see in the physical body of one person. But then you see that other people, maybe you have a second or a third crush. You're like, hey, wait a minute, she's kind of cute too. I don't know, which one do I like better? I can't decide. They're all so beautiful. And then you also notice that there are beautiful works of art and beauty in nature and all sorts of other types of things that are considered beautiful, things you're drawn towards in the same very same or similar sense as you were drawn towards that first crush. So then you start to contemplate, well, what is it about all these things, right? What is it about all these bodies, these forms, these fair forms, as your translation has it? What is it that makes them beautiful? Why do I see them as beautiful? And then you start to learn about the beauty within the soul and what makes a soul beautiful. So now we're getting a little bit further up the ladder. What makes a soul beautiful is that it acts virtuously, and it acts according to good rules of discipline and virtue and practice. So fair practices, following these fair practices, following these fair and good and just practices make the soul beautiful. So the beauty in the soul is dependent on the beauty of the practice. So that's a higher beauty, right? It causes the lower type of beauty. And then moving up even further, the ideas themselves. What is beauty, right? Or maybe even like he talks about in the dialogue. He talks about fair customs coming together and creating just societies and things like this. But when we get to the top, now we're talking about, up here to absolute beauty, we're talking about this form of the beautiful itself, and which is, the cause of all the other beauty below it. And, I think, again, we talked about this a lot last time, and I think a lot of you said some of this, what I'm about to say kind of echoes, I think, what some of you students have already said before. I'm kind of lost, okay? So if you're lost with all this stuff, don't feel alone, okay? I love Plato, but I have to admit, maybe I'm just not deep enough, right? Maybe I just am not a good philosopher. Maybe I got my mind in the gutter. You hear all these examples talking about pretty girls and stuff like this. Plato would just be scoffing at me, probably. I'm a brute in his mind, So what do I know about true beauty? I don't think he would consider me a proper, ascetic philosopher, right? I'm too attached to this physical conception of beauty. The closest thing that I can sort of come to is, and again, I think I used this example last week, so forgive me if I'm getting repetitive here, is I still don't think good enough for him. You know, I'm thinking of the like, beautiful people who have beautiful souls, you know, for lack of a better word. You know, people like one of my heroes, MLK, right? I mean, what he did in his life, the kind of person he was, the kind of speeches he gave with such conviction, and how he dedicated his life to such a just and noble cause. You know, even if I don't, you know, absolutely share his religious views, I think that they're beautiful and they made him a beautiful person. And so when I think of like this sort of deep sort of beauty, or maybe even, you know, since this is a class dealing with art, you know, that's more like an ethical, moral beauty. Um, you might think like a sad movie, like a really sad, tragic movie that doesn't make you feel good, and maybe it's actually shows you some horrific stuff, but it tells you something beautiful and deep about humankind or the human condition or something like that. So to me, those are sort of an abstract kind of a beauty, which I would say is as close as I could get to understanding what he's talking about here. But all of those examples I just gave, and ones that you might be thinking of, similar ones, I don't think would be correct for Plato. You know, for him, those are they're maybe kind of in the middle here. You know, see if we look at our little cave drawing, you know, when I'm looking at the pretty girl, that's probably as low as you're going to get, right? It's just a physical attraction. You know, if I'm just looking at somebody walking by, this beautiful woman, that would be that's the lowest form of beauty for him, would just be surface, right? And then I think if you have this, you know, sense of beauty for doing the right thing and honorable deeds, that you're kind of 2-3/3 of the way up here. But to get fully out of the cave, I don't think I can make it. I don't think I can make the journey here and see the beautiful itself. It seems to me more like a very abstract mathematical beauty. Something is beautiful simply because it's true and because it expresses a general, simple truth that applies to all things or as many things as possible, and tells us something about what is. And to me, it just seems sort of vague. Hey, um, what else do I want to say about poor Plato? I feel like I should say some nice things about him before we move on to Aristotle. Um, well, I think one also very relevant thing here that he does point out. I don't know if any of us like the way he handles it, but he does point to something pretty relevant. I think in this course we're going to see this issue pop up again and again. And what I'm talking about is the notion of how art affects us as a culture, as a society. You know, in this allegory of the cave, we have a situation where there's several people. He says most people. He seems to think the masses, you know, the majority of people, are in a very similar situation as these folks here, these prisoners in this cave story, in this myth of the cave. That, you know, we're sort of presented with a worldview, a sort of a narrative, if you will, that some people just sort of accept, right? We don't really get up behind it. And you know, for Plato's solution is that, well, one, if you're a philosopher, get up behind it, right? If you're a philosopher, take the journey out of the cave, understand the forms, you know, get to know what is really beautiful, not what appears to be beautiful, but is really just a shadow. So hopefully we can do that, right? But his other solution is most of us can't do that, right? The majority of us can't get out of the cave. Only a few people have a philosophical soul that are capable of taking this journey. And so for the rest of the masses, we just have to lie to them in a good way, right? Like we have to, you know, the puppet show that we produce, if we're the leaders of the city, has to lead them towards truth. And this is a very awkward notion of truth, right? Lying as leading towards truth, right? Telling someone a lie, you know, they're not going to do the right thing for the right reasons. And so you have to just sort of tell them some story like, oh, be good and then the gods will reward you. You know, even if you don't know that's true, just tell them anyways, because they're not going to behave. You know, this sort of dictatorial thinking, you know, I find kind of repugnant. I got to be honest. But on the other hand, I think he does have a point, right? The art that we consume obviously has an effect on the way we see things. And as much as I think Plato hated to, well, he admitted it, but he wanted to overcome it. Rhetoric, right? Who remembers what rhetoric is? I think rhetoric has a very deep effect. How something is said, the way it's said, the way something is messaged aesthetically, the way it's presented, can often make or break an argument. I mean, not all the populace thinks like philosophers. Not everybody has taken a philosophy class and has gone through these motions. And some people live their life. Unfortunately, I kind of agree with Plato. Some people live their life just kind of blindly accepting the stories they're told, and obviously you're here and you're learning, so hopefully you can get beyond this. And so again, I guess I should probably just shut up there because this is going to come back again and again. And by the way, one of your paper topics deals specifically with this issue, right? Of censorship, the proper way, to how does art affect the populace, etc. It's not stated quite as abstractly as all that. But I'll pause here for a second because for some reason I can't see the chat box. I've been having a lot of problems with Zoom lately. For some reason, the chat box just kind of comes and goes when I'm sharing the screen. So let me look here. I've got a couple comments. Somebody says, sounds like our government. Yeah, that's actually, Andrew, that's actually, believe it or not, I don't know if I thought we talked about this. That's pretty much who Plato has in mind when he's talking about the puppet masters in the story, when the allegory of the cave. He's thinking of the politicians. He thinks the politicians basically lie to the masses. They tell them a distorted version of the truth. It resembles the truth, just enough to convince them, and it leads them to wherever the politician wants them to be led. But Plato thinks a good philosopher should take the reins and guide them towards a good and just and fair society. And some people aren't going to be able to sort of get back behind it. So in a certain sense, maybe Plato begrudgingly would have to admit, he never, as far as I know, does this, but I think he would have to admit, maybe he does in the laws. Like I said, I admitted this last week. I've never read the laws from cover to cover, but I would say he would have to admit that you sort of, art is necessary. Like you need it, even if you're this art hater like Plato, who thinks that all art is deceptive and all art is bad. In a certain sense, it's all far from the truth. It's all imitation of the truth. It seems like even he had to acquiesce. And I think, again, I haven't read the laws, but I mentioned it because from my understanding, the laws is a more practical guide to governing society. And in the laws, I think he actually comes up with this story about what sort of gods that the perfect society should worship, and they should believe the sun is God and all this stuff. And so as much as Plato begrudges art for its deception, he engages in that deception himself. So you might say he's a bit hypocritical. And I got to say, I think he's a pretty good writer. So for someone who hates art and poetry so much, or so suspicious of it, he sure is good at it, which is kind of ironic, I find. But anyways, all right. Well, that's my bit about Plato, and probably more than I meant to say, but let's get started on Aristotle, unless there's any more comments or questions about Plato or objections. Let's see. Are we getting close to the idea that beauty is subjective or objective? I thought we've already talked about that. I mean, that's going to keep coming up again and again. Every one of these philosophers is going to address that question. I guess maybe I haven't really spelled it out. Who can answer for Plato here? Is beauty objective or is it subjective? What is Plato going to say? Anybody have any ideas? Oh, yeah, Charles is right. Objective. Yeah, everybody else is right. Objective. Yeah, for Plato, there is an objective standard of beauty. The problem is, but Eduardo, but he's wrong. Yeah, I would agree. I'm kind of with Eduardo. As much as I love Plato, I love reading him, love studying him. I think he's fascinating, thought-provoking, all that good stuff. I'm kind of with Eduardo here. Maybe art or maybe beauty isn't subjective. Maybe there is an objective standard, but I sure don't think Plato's really established it. He seems to think he has. It kind of goes back to the beginning argument, the very beginning of the Plato chapter. He seems to think, look, if you've got such a thing as art, and remember the word art is in Greek techne here, so it's much broader. So if you have art, you have a techne, a craft, a skill, a discipline. that means there are standards. There have to be standards. But if there's no standards, there's no art. And that's kind of his argument that those two imply each other. Um, this might be because he has a limited view. His culture had a limited view of what art was, and maybe we have a much broader view now of what art is. It's not just a discipline or a techne. But you're going to see when we get to Aristotle, he seems to kind of agree, at least on that point, that when we're talking about making stuff that's beautiful, there's a certain skill to it, and then there is a certain objective standard. It's not quite as absolute, perhaps, as Plato makes it out to be. But yeah, he thinks for sure there is a standard of beauty. The problem is, though, for Plato, we're never really going to understand it unless we use philosophy. We can't see beauty through our senses, and that's what makes me so confused. Is it seems to me like beauty is primarily a sensual phenomenon. You see it through your eyes, you hear it through your ears. I mean, I gave a couple examples about, how beautiful I thought, MLK was a beautiful person, and maybe that sad movie it was a beautiful movie. It made me kind of sad, but it was just kind of beautiful. I mean, those are kind of like, I guess that's not a part of the five senses. It's an emotion that I feel, but still it's very visceral, right? It's not something abstract and rational the way that Plato makes it out to be. At least that's my argument against him. But he's gonna say, no, there's an objective standard, and we're stuck with our bodies, we're stuck in our physical form. So maybe we'll never really be able to understand the beautiful fully. He thinks, though, we can have glimpses of it. What's really preventing us is the fact that we're stuck in our body, right? Maybe when we die, our soul can escape this prison. Socrates often refers to his body as a prison, and then we can contemplate the beautiful itself completely. But he honestly also, this is, maybe I shouldn't even mention this because it's going to open up a whole door of other objections and thoughts, but Plato seemed to argue that all these forms, whether we're talking about justice, beauty, the good, the form of chairness, the form of penness, or, like he thought that the forms, whatever they were, that our soul already had knowledge of them. It just had to be unlocked. So the idea is that because our soul is immortal, apparently, Plato thought our soul was not, it's not like our body. Our body, it lives, and only for one life, comes and goes. But our soul is non-material, so it doesn't die, he argued in some of his dialogues. But because of that, he thought, our soul has this eternal knowledge. It's just when we're born into a physical form, we forget everything. And so learning is really just remembering. So when we see something beautiful, like a physical thing that we think is beautiful, that is a belief. That's a subjective opinion. It's not knowledge for him, right? So in that sense, beauty is subjective. Like beauty, the judgments of beauty we make about physical things are subjective, but they're based on what he thinks, this internal knowledge. We see that physical, whatever, a beautiful rainbow, a beautiful human being that we're attracted to, and somehow our soul just kind of knows it. We're like, oh, that's this beauty, whatever it is, we might not have a word for it yet, but we have a feeling that corresponds to it. And so for Plato, it's like that's just hardwired in us. Somebody asked, is there a difference between Platonic forms and Jungian archetypes? Yeah, I don't want to get too much into it because I think it would get beyond the scope of the class. But I would say, at least, and I'm not an expert on Jung, but from my understanding of Jung, I think the big difference, and there's not much, not much, but the big difference is I think that Jung thought of these as evolutionary. He didn't argue a lot. So if you're familiar with the psychoanalyst Carl Jung, he thought that there were these archetypes that all human beings shared, and that we were hardwired with them, that they were passed on from our ancestors. And a lot of the evidence that he tries to use to prove these archetypes is he'll look to different religions and different myths from different cultures, and he'll point to the Virgin Mother. That's something that's in a lot of different religions. The Virgin Mother, the nurturing, pure, innocent You know, that's in Buddhism, it's in Hindu, it's in Christianity. um you know, there's these archetypes, you know, the watchful father Zeus, or you know, or the Christian god. And so he argues that you can find these in different parts of the world, even though these people aren't aware of each other historically, they didn't know each other, because these archetypes, you know, I think that Plato might like that. He might like Jung's theory, but what he wouldn't like is that for him, it locates it too much within us. These forms, although we are able to know them with our soul, they're not in our soul and they don't depend on our soul. And again, my understanding of Jung is that these archetypes were inherited. So through time, humanity has developed, you know, what he calls a collective unconscious. And so when we're born, we already have these sort of symbols, these metaphors in our minds, and that's how we kind of pattern our life and how we organize things. But yeah, I mean, it's similar. It's definitely similar. So you're right to think about Jung when we're talking about Plato's forms. But again, for him, they're very metaphysical. Whereas I think that, you know, Jung kind of flirted. He made a lot of metaphysical comments about the archetypes, but I think he was kind of careful every time he did that and sort of said, well, you know, try to keep it, you know, just based on my observations. But anyways, anything else that anybody wants to know about Plato, or any comments you want to make? Okay, it looks like everybody's satisfied. And if something comes up, and maybe even too, when we're talking about Aristotle, you're going to see that, you know, Aristotle's he's a student of Plato, right? He studied at Plato's school, but in many ways he's quite divergent from Plato. Okay, he's almost a 180 in his approach, especially to metaphysics and how he sees, for Plato, you might say that the ideas take precedent. You know, Plato's often called an idealist. That's confusing to a lot of students because you hear the word idealists and maybe you're familiar with it and you're thinking, oh, like someone who's like really optimistic, you know, and just always wants things perfect. They're an idealist. He's an idealist, certainly in that sense, in that more colloquial sense. But he's also an idealist, Plato is, in a metaphysical sense. Because remember, for him, the forms, in fact, let me go back to that screen real quick. Remember, the forms are more real than the physical things. So he thinks, you know, like the idea of a chair causes the physical chair, and the physical chair causes the painter to paint a painting of it. And so at each level, you're further removed from the real and further removed from the absolute truth. So to me, I find this very counterintuitive to think of an idea, this abstract thought of beauty itself, the good itself, justice itself. It's not intuitive for me to think of those as more real than a beautiful lake, a beautiful scene at a lake, a beautiful painting in a museum. Those seem more real to me than the idea of beauty. And so I think in general, a lot of students feel this way, that Plato is very counterintuitive in that sense. But Aristotle, you're going to see, he flips the script, right? It's the ideas. They can't really be in the separate category, or they can't be separated from the physical stuff, right? The physical stuff, matter, whatever you want to call it, is what is, and form is just an aspect of that. Form is just a part of that. So he sort of, you might say, Aristotle kind of redefines what form is. He uses it in a different sense. And so that might be kind of confusing at first. I'm probably going to, at least when we get started here, I'm going to reference back to Plato every once in a while to clarify the difference, how they're using these terms. And I've already said this before, but it bears repeating. One thing I don't like about this textbook is that it uses all these different translations. And so I'm going to have to, I put a lot of words in brackets and parentheses to try to help us a little bit and guide us through this. But yeah, I don't know. I guess it's a price you pay because it's a cheap textbook and it has a lot of stuff in it. So, we'll have to deal with all these different translations. Let me get back to the Plato, and then I think I hit escape out of this. I can just go to, okay, let me go to whoops, did not mean to do that. Let me go to Aristotle. So, Aristotle. He's considered by a lot of people as the greatest philosopher who ever existed. You hear that about him. Sometimes you hear that about Kant. I hate anybody saying that about anybody. The greatest anything that ever existed. I think all the greats were great for their own reason. So it's kind of hard to say the greatest, but I can see why you would call him the greatest philosopher of all time because of his influence, just how much impact he's had on Western civilization. It's hard to overstate, really. So as I mentioned earlier, he's a student of Plato. We don't really think they ever met each other actually in real life. Although, maybe let me actually, I'm going to look up, there's a famous painting. I think somebody actually mentioned this last week, or it might have been one of my other classes. There's a famous painting that shows Aristotle and Plato like hanging out together, and that probably never happened. But it's this famous painting, and since it's an art class, what the heck? Let's check this out. Why can't I go to my? Okay, here we go. So let me look this up. I'll just look it up on Google Images. It's by Raphael. I'm sure you guys have heard of Raphael, not the Ninja Turtle, but the famous Renaissance painter. Let me find a good image of the School of Athens so I can show you this famous painting with all the philosophers in it. So this is actually a fresco, I think, at the Vatican. I don't know if that's the best one we got. Let's see. Open image, new tab. Okay, so I guess it's as good as we're gonna get. The two old guys in the middle, right? I guess there's a lot of old guys. I didn't really narrow it down much. The one on the left with his hand is pointed up, that's supposed to be Plato, and next to him is Aristotle. And Plato has his Timaeus. That's the book where he writes about the creation of the universe by the divine mind, using knowledge of the forms, the higher forms. And then Aristotle's got a copy of the Ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics, where he's talking about how to live your life practically and to achieve happiness, or eudaimonia, this flourishing of your soul. So this sort of represents, I guess, pictorially, it's like an allegory for their approach to philosophy. Of course, Plato's got his finger pointed upwards to the heavens, to this higher realm beyond space and time, this eternal world of forms. And Plato's kind of like, Aristotle's kind of like, no, let's bring it back down to earth here. It's not that Plato is skewed form. Again, like I said, he talks about form, but he says that Plato is confused by separating form and making form something separate, a part of some higher realm, is a huge mistake. And it leads to all sorts of philosophical conundrums, which I don't know if we really need to get into for the purposes of this class. They're going to come up. Some of them are going to come up in our exploration of Aristotle. So let's get back to that. Let me see how I'm doing on time here. Oh, geez. I'm already 45 minutes in. We haven't even got started on Aristotle. I better shut up and get to the slideshow. Okay, so let's look at the title I have of this PowerPoint presentation. So Aristotle's Aesthetics. Again, I guess you could even call this class Intro to Aesthetics, really. Philosophy of Art and Beauty. But the subtitle, Art, Nature, Teleology, there's a new word. I don't think we've seen that yet. Beauty and Rhetoric. So art, obviously, for Aristotle, that's, again, a form of techne, right? What we think of as art, painting, sculpting, it's just one among many techni, right? It's an art. And art and nature, right? There are very analogous processes in the creation of works of art and the growth of things in nature. And so this first part of the lecture, I hope we can get through that before our break, is to kind of explore this connection between art and nature and the analogies that he finds between growth in nature, procreation, and the creation of new things in art. There's differences, obviously, he's going to point those out as well. There's also some similarities. Beauty, Okay, that's probably going to be something we're going to have to wait till next week. It's not till the end of the chapter that he really narrows in on what it means to be beautiful, what beauty is. And I think his definition is going to be much more straightforward and a little bit less vague than Plato's. Rhetoric. This is a word I've already used before, and I just kind of assumed you were understanding me when I was using it. So maybe I should pause here for a minute. Can someone tell me? Maybe you've taken a class in philosophy before, and you know what teleology means, or what the Greek word telos means. I don't think I've used that yet. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think we covered this yet. Can anybody tell me what teleology or what telos is, or take your pick, or rhetoric? Can you remind us what is rhetoric?
So, teleology is the study of anything, events, with concern to their purpose rather than their cause.
Okay, good, right. So you use the word purpose. That's great. The word telos can be translated as that, right? Purpose is a good translation of telos. You could also translate it as function. You could translate it as end, as in like your goal, what are you aiming for? Aim is also another translation, goal, right? So everything that the process is leading up to, and as you put it very, very articulately, in a very articulate manner, it's the study of things in general with regards to that end, right? So when you're studying the universe, you're assuming that it's moving towards some telos or some aim or some end, and that's Aristotle's approach to just about everything. If you want to understand I don't know, this lighter or this pen, you have to understand it in terms, primarily for him, there's many things to it, but primarily you have to understand it in terms of its telos, its end, its aim. Potential. Yes, potential is part of it, right? That's going to be a big part of it. Its potential is going to help determine what it can be used for. So its potential is a part of its, is going to help us determine its telos, or what it can be used for. But it looks like Charles has got rhetoric pretty close. I mean, I'm fine with his definition. Argumentative technique, maybe a little bit better, because in philosophy we're nitpicky about our words. And when we talk about arguments and argumentative technique, we usually have logic in mind, and understanding good arguments and bad arguments, and good reasoning and bad reasoning. And rhetoric isn't so much concerned with that as it is with the presentation of the argument, and whether it sounds good and whether it sounds persuasive. And so it's more of a style. We're looking at the style of it. And Aristotle wrote a book on rhetoric. And so he thought that it was actually a useful tool. I think he had a little bit less disdain for rhetoric than Plato did. Maybe he was more honest about the claim I make, that you're gonna have to use a little art, you're gonna have to use a little aesthetics to get your point across. It's sad but true. I wish we could just state things factually to people in a rational manner and get them to buy into it and believe it. But some people, they need a little poetry, right? To sort of, a little sugar. Yeah, that would be boring, right? I like Eduardo says, that'd be boring. Yeah, it'd be boring, but also it's just not effective. I mean, it's just part of our psychology. I think it doesn't work. It's maybe sad but true. So let's get started here. Let's see what I've got. There's a lot of, like I said, a lot of different selections here. They bounce around a lot. So it's, there's passages from metaphysics, and then they go to, on the generation and corruption of animals, and then they go back to the metaphysics. And so they're bouncing around all over the place. And again, one thing I really don't like is that there's not a consistent translation. So some of these terms will be, different in different quotes. And so I'll try to address that as I go along and make it less confusing. So who remembers what is metaphysics? What are we doing when we do metaphysics? I feel like last week that's all we did was cover metaphysics, because Plato is such a metaphysical philosopher. But what real briefly, who can kind of sum it up? What are we doing when we do metaphysics? What kind of questions are we answering? You can type it in the chat or pipe on in.
I think it's the nature of reality.
Right. So you're asking questions about sort of the basic nature, the fundamental nature of reality, all that is. And so Aristotle is, he's writing this book about, the sort of nature of everything it is, no matter what we're talking about, whether it's a human being, whether it's, this pen that I keep referring to, or the laptop that I'm using to, give this meeting here. All things, he says, this is true of all things. They come about through one of these four ways. I guess for our purposes, we're more focused on the first one. But we need to distinguish it from all the others as well, to get a fuller grasp of what is art in Aristotle's mind. So let's go through all of them. Okay, so all things that are, everything that exists, comes into being. It exists because of art, right? That's one reason that it comes into being, or just nature, right? Nature, it's created in nature. The third is luck, and the fourth is what he calls spontaneity. And 1 and 2 relate to 3 and 4 in a very sort of analogous way. There's sort of like a parallel here, right? So art, he says, is any principle of movement in something other than the thing moved. Okay, so if I take a rock and I pile it up into like a nice neat pile and make rock art, which by the way I heard is really not good. You shouldn't do that. It's like bad for the environment or something like that. I don't know if you've seen like all those piles of rocks, if you've ever been like hiking out in like streams and stuff. Anyway, that's art, right? Those rocks couldn't move themselves. Somebody had to take them and move them and put them there. That was not a result of nature. Nature is a principle of movement in the thing itself. If a rock chips off the side of a cliff and falls down, that's an act of nature. It comes into being through nature. Luck, he says, is a privation of art, and this might get a little bit controversial when we start applying his theory of art to actual works of art, especially contemporary art. You might push back on this insistence. So if you do something out of luck, that's a privation of art. There's no art involved. There's no skill or standard that you're applying and trying to move it. You just maybe you throw a bunch of pebbles together in a pile and they happen to look cool, even though someone might say, hey, that's a work of art. Not for Aristotle, because there was no forethought. They just randomly fell and happened to look good. So that would not be a work of art. Spontaneity, something happens spontaneously. This is kind of a weird definition, but for him, I guess not super weird, but it kind of begs the question of, is there anything spontaneous? He says, if something doesn't happen by nature, that would be spontaneous. So I suppose the best example I can think of that's really not that problematic is, if I do something that would be against my nature, right? Like I'm trying to, I was going to use the example of going to the doctor and having them hit your knee with the mallet and getting you to just kick your leg. I guess that would not be spontaneous, because that would actually be in accordance with nature, right? Your nerves are acting exactly like it's supposed to. Jackson Pollock. Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, he's going to say that Jackson Pollock probably wouldn't be an artist, I mean, maybe Pollock, if you're not familiar with Jackson Pollock, some of you might not have never heard of the guy. A lot of his works, they're drip. He would drip the paint, or he would splash it or splatter it. And so, for Aristotle, the artist has to have a conception of the finished product, the telos, the aim, or else it's not art. It's just luck if it looks good. But, I would say that him just dripping paint is spontaneous. Like, he just, right? There's no forethought, like the actual act itself. The product, I don't know. It seems like that's a tough one, and I'm not sure it's going to fit so nicely into these categories, right? It's a pretty good example, actually. But yeah, I'm trying to think of a better example, like that's real clear cut from nature. From spontaneity, privation of nature. So I guess he would say, like, it's in our nature, like humans, it's in our nature to act rationally. So maybe if we acted completely irrationally, that would be spontaneous. So like normally, like we would, if we were like really hungry and we needed some healthy food to eat, we would it would be natural. It'd be a part of our nature. Like within us, our stomach would get hungry, right? It would be we wouldn't decide to be hungry. So it's a principle of movement in the thing itself, right? We're just hardwired to get hungry when we need food. We don't decide to want to get hungry. And then I guess like if we didn't eat, maybe that would be spontaneous. I don't know, right? That would be, again, though, I don't think that's the best example. Maybe I should move on, and a better example will pop in my mind, because I'm thinking there might be rational reasons why we wouldn't eat, right? Maybe we're like doing intermittent fasting or something, and we like want to be healthy, and so like we read all this scientific stuff. So we were using our rational nature, which is a part of our nature for Aristotle, to abstain from this from this what I would call more spontaneous hunger. So let's move on, because I think maybe I'll have a better example here in a minute once I start reading some more stuff. This is where it gets interesting, because this is where he's going to start to diverge very obviously from Plato. So when we look at what what Aristotle is calling substance here, what you might call stuff, right? Physical matter stuff. Okay. For him, there are three senses or three kinds of what you might call substance. There's what, again, sort of the more brute, basic understanding, just the physical matter of it, which he often describes as a this in appearance. So when we use our senses, I look at a thing like this pen, and it separates itself to my perception. It looks different, and it's unique. It has its own substance. It's unlike the air that's around it. It's unlike the fingers that are holding it, right? And so it's got its own material that separates it from all other things. But then there's also what he calls substance in terms of a nature. There's a positive, as he calls it, a positive state towards which movement takes place. So this pen has a tendency, it has a nature, because it's made of heavy stuff, it's made of material, it has a tendency to fall. It moves towards the ground because of its weight. Okay, if it's unsupported, and I have a tendency, because I want to write some notes, I might, in my nature, if I need to write, I move towards grabbing it and using it. Okay. So that's another substance, right? There's the matter, right? The actual stuff. And then there's the movement within, right? The what's a better word for that? A tendency towards. Okay, and then he also uses substance, and so this gets kind of confusing. He uses substance in the sense of each individual thing, okay? So every individual thing is its own unique thing. He gives the example of Socrates. There's only one Socrates, and he's a particular substance. The substance of Socrates, the man Socrates. Oh, proclivity, I like that, Charles. That's good. I like that word. It's fancier. Yeah, the nature, the second one is kind of a proclivity. I love it. Yeah, but then the third one again is substance in terms of like we're each of us are our own individual substance, right? Professor Ross, me, I'm a substance. So for him, and this is where again you're going to see he's starting to diverge from Plato with his description of what it is to be a substance, what a form is in Aristotle's mind. But he's going to say that sometimes too, right? Sometimes what we call this proclivity, this inherent movement towards something, he says sometimes it does not exist at all apart from the actual thing. So as he puts it, the form of house, right? What a house is meant to do, right? Shelter people, I guess, like what its purpose is, right? What it tends towards. It tends towards sheltering us from the elements, et cetera, because of the way it's built, obviously. For him, this notion of what a form is supposed to be and why it's supposed to be that and why it has this, why it must be built the way it must be built, that wouldn't exist without the art of houses. Or sorry, the art of houses wouldn't exist without houses. Okay, so he's reversed in the order basically here for Plato. For Plato, the idea comes first. There's this sort of what it is to be a house, what it is to be a good house, the nature of houses, and then humans are able, because there is such a thing as the nature of a house, the essence of a house, what it means to be a good house, what all houses aim towards if they're good, that comes later, right? And I think, and Andrew says, and this is a question, deriving from their function, Exactly. In fact, sometimes Aristotle will talk about form synonymously with function. So when he's talking about the form of house, the art of house, he's talking about what's the function. And this is very similar to I don't know if it was this class, but somebody gave an example of like we were talking about the form of chair, and someone's like, "Hey man, just put a boulder up against the cave wall." That might have been the first chair, and that's sort of the Aristotle answer. There wasn't this, human notion of chairness, and then all of a sudden humans were like, "We must make this perfect thing real," and we kept trying. No, there was a need for a seat or whatever, and there were materials around. There was matter that had a potential to be used to sit on. Some of it was more comfortable than others. We messed with it a bit, and then further and further through understanding the aim, through understanding the telos, we organized the production of that object around this sort of preconceived idea of what we needed. So it was all based around its function. Right. So for Aristotle, form and function, or you might say they might even really be the same thing in a certain sense. But they're certainly tied together. I know other commentators, they explain it in a different way. They talk about how for Aristotle, form reveals function. So when I tell you that the form of this is pen, what that means is you use it to write. That's what it means. Pens are for writing. So its form is its function. And so if you see look at the way that thing is shaped, it must be a chair. Look at the way that thing is formed, it must be a table. And so again, form and function they're either the same thing, depending on how you read him, or they're definitely tied together. Okay. For him too, so this little quote, if the this exists apart from the concrete thing, it is only in the case of natural objects. So if there are forms, these Platonic forms that Plato talks about, if there is a form of beauty or a form of justice, he says it could only be true in the case of natural objects, not in the case of man-made objects. If something is the product of art, then there's a preceding idea, and then a conception, right? We have a notion, and then we make the thing. So for Aristotle, there's no separate, there's no chairness without actual chairs. There's no houseness without the art and actual houses. If there is such a thing as a form separate from things, it can only occur in nature. He'll and he's even going to back up on this. You're going to see in a minute. But at this point, he's like, well, if there are these things, these forms that Plato talks about, they only apply to natural objects occurring in nature. The form of house does not occur in nature. Right? It occurs in the mind of man. It occurs in the mind of a human, but not in nature. And we'll see this in a minute. He'll allow, maybe it completes what nature begins. Nature brings forth materials that are appropriate for us to use to make houses. But the house itself, houseness and houses don't exist in nature. They are the product of art. They are the product, and remember what he says about art. It's a principle of movement in something other than the thing moved. Right? We cut down trees. We mine for metals, and we create these structures. That's something that is not in the structures themselves, or in the matter themselves. Okay, so moving on. Okay, so now we get to his causes. This is where things get kind of confusing, kind of subtle. This will be, I think, if we have time this semester and we can get to Heidegger at the very end, this will be important when we get to Heidegger, because he makes a big deal about this. Heidegger thinks that modern humans have lost this sense of causality that you find in the Greeks. We think of causality really only in the sense of the second kind. But for Aristotle, he had 4 types of causes. Everything that exists is caused by something else, and there are 4 parts of 4 elements that cause it. And so we're going to have to, I'm using the standard sort of nomenclature. This is actually not in your textbook. I don't think that they use these words, but in almost every textbook, this is what they'll be listed as. If you take a class in Intro to Philosophy and you learn about Aristotle's 4 causes, they'll usually be labeled as such. There's the material cause, the efficient cause, the formal cause, and the final cause. So let me read this quote here, and I'll try to explain as best I can what's going on here. What does he mean? What are the four causes? Again, I think today Heidegger would agree. We really think of cause only really in terms of the second type, and to our detriment. Also, it gives us a very what's a good word? Incomplete view of how things go in the world and how things are organized. So Aristotle writes, and again, this is all still from the Metaphysics. He says the moving causes, what I would call the efficient causes, more traditionally called the efficient cause. The moving causes exist as things preceding the effects. Causes, in the sense of definitions, are simultaneous with the effects. Okay, so the very confusing passage, if you've never read Aristotle, or you've never studied him before, most of this stuff's probably really confusing. So let me try to help. So again, everything that exists, I've got a picture here of a bronze sphere because that's the example that he uses. So everything that is part of reality, it has four causes. The bronze sphere, well, it's made of bronze. That's the matter, that's the material that causes it, it's made of. So that would be the cause in the first sense of cause for Aristotle. Right? So the material cause is what it is made of, the matter. The efficient, or what he's referring to as the moving cause in this quote, is, well, maybe someone could take a stab at it. Again, I said that this is what we understand by the term cause today. When you say that X caused Y or Y caused Z, what do you usually mean? What's a synonym for that? What else could you say instead of X caused Y or or Y caused Z? What do we mean by that? He's calling it a moving cause. What is a cause? What's another way of saying cause? It's a very abstract word, kind of hard to define without using the word, right? What does it mean to cause something? Usually, what do we usually mean by that?
To make something happen?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, to make something happen, to bring something about. Somebody says to create. Not always, but that, I think if you create, that'd be a form of it, right? And so. And certainly, I think that might be a good way to think about it here because that's usually how he thinks of it. So, like the efficient cause of this bronze sphere would be whoever made it, right? That would be the blacksmith or whoever molded it. That would be the efficient. Or I guess if you want to get real scientific and technical, you could say, oh, it was the heat that was applied to the metal, and it was the mold and the chemical reactions, and that was what caused it, you know what I mean? But just to keep it simple, we'll just say, yeah, the blacksmith, he made it. He brought it about. So, and he says in the quote, the moving causes exist as things preceding the effects. So the blacksmith existed before the thing he made. Okay, and all those processes, you know, the heat, the pressure, the pouring the melted metal into the mold, letting it cool, separating the mold out, smoothing it out, all of those efficient causes came before the thing. All right, now it's here. Okay. I still haven't given you the definition of a formal cause, but that's what he's referring to here as causes in the sense of definition. So a formal cause in this case would be a bronze sphere. That's just what it is. And again, somebody already said this. You're kind of already catching on to his way of thinking, I think already. Somebody is, at least. I hope everybody is, or most of you. That form also reveals function, right? So it's like when I say it's a bronze sphere, I don't know if that's that helpful. Like what the heck do you use a bronze sphere for? Maybe decoration. Maybe if you're Olympian and you're trying to throw it or something, for exercise. But yeah, so form is what it is. What do you define it as? And it usually will reveal its purpose, but it's not always the same. And that's when we get to the final cause, which is its purpose. That's its function. right? So we can try this with with man-made objects. This is pretty easy. With objects in nature, not so much. With like, let's say you're looking at, like, you're a blacksmith who's making a battle axe. Obviously, the material cause of the battle axe would be bronze or whatever metal that you're using to make the axe with. Maybe leather, if you got like a little leather strap on the handle or whatever. And if you're the blacksmith, maybe you are the efficient cause, and also your strength and your power and the pressure that you're using and all that. Those would be the efficient causes of the battle axe. And what is it? It's a battle axe. So that's it. It's an axe that is used to fight with, right? To kill your enemy in battle. That's its form. And well, I kind of gave the answer to the final cause, right? What's its purpose? What is it used for? It's to fight. It's a battle axe. So that's its final cause. That's its purpose. And when we come to like things in nature, it's kind of hard to answer this. Like, what is the final cause of just some pebble? I mean, the first three, okay, like the material cause, it's a certain type of rock. You could maybe do an analysis of its chemical structure, and that's its efficient cause. If you're like a geologist and you know about all how stones and different minerals are made and all the pressure and all that geophysics about it, the efficient cause of the pebble, and it's a pebble, but what's its purpose? And someone says to do work upon something. I don't know if that was your answer but that's kind of it. He might say that you're going to use the pebble for like some art, like maybe you're going to put it as part of your building or something. But for Aristotle, he's going to say everything has a purpose. Everything that exists in the universe is there for some reason, and once its purpose is fulfilled, once that pebble, whatever it's used for, is used, it is part of something bigger. It's part of like a bigger structure. Let's say I use the pebble as a part of a really pretty wall that's got all these little different colored pebbles, and I put them together with some mortar, and I make it all real nice looking structure. Right now, it's a part of this wall that itself has its own form, its own purpose, and it's going to help develop further structures. So for Aristotle, the whole universe, in a sense, is interrelated in this way. All things have a final purpose, including us, all humans. We try to fulfill that purpose. We're given certain matter, certain material. For instance, you might have, let's say, a lump of clay. Given its matter, given the type of material that it's made out of, it has certain potential. Right? Somebody commented earlier, is matter potential? Yes, in a certain sense it is. Matter, a lump of clay has potential to be used to make all sorts of things. You can make a brick with it. You can make a sculpture with it, all sorts of things. You wouldn't want to make a brick out of Jell-O, right? That would be different material, which wouldn't be appropriate for making a brick. A Jell-O brick would suck, right? Like, it might be kind of cool looking. Oh, wow, I made a whole wall of Jell-O bricks, right? And then and then it just gets all gross and falls apart after a day, right? But the point is, everything has sort of inherent potential to become something else. And once it realizes that, its nature is to sort of gravitate towards that purpose. Once it fulfills that purpose, it is supposed to allow for the further development of other things. So again, though, for him, though, he thinks that these formal causes, right, what a thing is, how I define a thing as a thing, right, whether it's a bronze sphere or whether it's a house or a chair or a table, he says they are simultaneous. So they're at the same time as their effects. So in other words, the definition of bronze sphereness, what if that's such a thing, bronze sphereness, does not exist without bronze spheres. Okay, crooked nosedness doesn't exist without crooked nose. That he uses that example. That's why like crooked nosedness. Where's he coming up with this stuff? It's an example he uses, right? The form doesn't exist without the thing. That the form and matter are tied together. They're just two aspects of all things. So again, when a man is healthy, then health also exists. If there were no healthy men or no healthy anything, there'd be no such thing as health. Okay, so this is where he definitely diverges from Plato. Um, things don't exist unless there's a, well, so Andrew says things don't exist unless there's an example of it somewhere. Well, the idea doesn't exist unless there's an example of it somewhere. So the idea of houseness, what it is to be a house, wouldn't exist if there weren't already houses in the world. If we weren't building houses, um, the form has to come from existence. That's kind of a good way to put it. Yeah, the form has to come from, well, in a way, the form is what nature is moving towards. Okay, so maybe I should move to the next slide here. Let me read this quote, and then I think after that, I'm kind of going to answer your question. So hold your horses here. He says, so evidently there's no necessity on this ground, at least, for the existence of ideas, right? The Platonic forms. For man is begotten by man, a given man by an individual father, and similarly in the arts, for the medical art is the formal cause of health. Okay, so what is he saying in this quote here? Again, the reason we have a concept of humans, man, female, whatever, deer, cow, circle, is because there are circles, because there are cows, because there are men, because there are, and so for Plato, it's like, well, where do they come from? You know, that's Plato's big conundrum. There must be manness itself. There must be beauty itself that causes beautiful things. And he says, no. Aristotle's, no. Things have beauty. They have beauty, and they pass it on to other things. It's a part of their, you know, you might say DNA. I hesitate to use that word because they didn't have a concept of DNA in ancient Greece. But, you know, this is sort of what he's saying in the quote here, right? Man is something that exists in nature. It's a type, and man gives birth to another man or woman or whatever, humans. And that's where this concept of man comes from. It's a sort of definition, and all men, and this is where he is kind of like Plato in a certain sense, that all humans are aiming towards a perfect form of human, right? So our aims, if we're good humans, are almost like our aims if we're a plant, if we're a good plant. A good plant aims towards nutrition and flourishing and being as green as a plant can possibly be and getting as much nutrients from the soil and as much sunlight as possible. And once it does all that, it becomes as healthy a plant as possible. And every plant is similar in its what makes a good rose bush a good rose bush is the same, right? It's a part of their nature. All roses need the same sort of climate, the same sort of conditions to flourish. And he thinks the same is true of all natural types. Humans are natural types. And so there is a perfect state that we're all trying to achieve when we're trying to be our best selves. And that's where the notion of human comes from. You know, the form of man, the form of rose, the form of, you know, again, there's this aim, this telos, in nature that all good things, insofar as they're good, aim towards. And again, that's not some separate, you know, Platonic form in the ether, right, up in heaven, in Plato's heaven. It's actually, he describes it, the form is embedded in us. It's a part of our nature. Again, I was about to say DNA, but, you know, he didn't have a term like that back then. So that's, you know, again, he's gonna elaborate on this a little bit. So there's all these comments on potency. I don't know if I like the word potency as a translation because it has all sorts of connotations to it that are, I think, distracting. But maybe the word power or capacity or ability to do something is better. But that's what he's talking about. You know, but for him, when we use it, you know, and I don't really know the Greek term, forgive me. Maybe it's more ambiguous than the English term. But he says, you know, these words have different meanings. You know, you can talk about, you know, you can use the word, you know, in geometry that something is to the power of something else. But he thinks that the word potency has a primary sense. There's a primary sense of capacity, potency, ability, whatever. And he says it's this. It's an originative source of change. So it's the origin of change, what you might call the efficient cause if you're Aristotle, or just cause if you're, like us, just speaking regular English. But it's the originative source of change in another thing or in the thing itself qua other. Okay, that's pretty vague and pretty abstract. So let's see if he elaborates on this a little bit. Okay, so he's going to distinguish between two types of this, what he's calling potency. Okay, maybe we look at these types, it'll become clear what he means by this, and where he's going with this too. How does this apply to philosophy of art? Okay, you might be wondering, right? Trust me, we'll get back to art really quick, right? In fact, I've only got like 10 or 15 minutes before our break, so I'm gonna try to get to a good stopping point and try to bring it back to art before break time. But let's look at this notion of potency. At least that's how it's translated in our textbook. Potency, power, capacity, whatever. So what he calls potency of acting, the ability to act, okay? And then the ability to be acted on. The first one I think sounds more intuitive to most of you. Probably when you think of potency or power or capacity, you're probably only thinking of potency in the first sense of that term, okay? The second one maybe is not as intuitive. That's the one that probably needs a little bit more explaining, okay? So being acted on, okay, as he puts it, it contains, if something has this type of potency, what that means is it contains a certain originative source. For that which is oily can be burnt, and that which yields in a particular way can be crushed, and similarly in all cases. So you might think to the example of the Jell-O I was giving earlier, right? Or the lump of clay. It has a certain potential to be acted on. You can mold the clay if it's not dry yet. You can mold the clay to all these different shapes. It has a certain ability to be acted on a certain way, just like oily things can be burnt. Your body might have a certain potency to be acted on a certain way. If I press my skin, it gives a little bit, right? Up to a certain point. Okay, it can take on a certain amount of elements, and some it can't take on. So again, that's the potency of being acted upon. Now, acting, this is sort of what someone can do, right? What can you do? More active potency on other things. So heat, as he puts it, is present in that which can produce heat. The art of building, the knowledge, the know-how, the techne, the skill of how to build stuff is present in the person who knows how to build, in the actual physical human being, or in their soul, as he sometimes puts it, right? The form of house is in the person who knows what a good house is. This is another thing where he's not with Plato, right? For Plato, form of house is in Plato's heaven. It's a separate thing, separate. If there were no men to think it or women to think it, it still would exist. No. The art, the knowledge of house building is in the soul of men who know how to build houses. That's where it's located.
So Aristotle's here saying that like the art of building acts upon people who can build.
I guess he could say that. Yeah, he could maybe say that. What he would say is he'd probably say it would go both ways. Okay, so if you're someone who builds buildings and that's your art, that's your techne, he would probably say that certainly the knowledge of the building acts on your soul, but you also act on it. So that's a very good question. In this example, he seems to be saying that the knowledge of, I guess, how to build a building is potency in the first sense, right? If you have knowledge of how to build, you're able to use that knowledge to actually to build a building. And if you're a fire, you have the ability to burn stuff, right? And so he seems to be talking about it, but it might go both ways, right? So I have to think about this more. Maybe if you have an example that you have in mind, perhaps the fact that someone has that knowledge, it allows them to be convinced of certain things. And so maybe like I'm trying to think of a good example. Again, if you're an expert builder, and you're listening to some politician who has knowledge of building as well, maybe they might be more convincing you, like about a project that needs to be done or something like that. I don't know. If you have something in mind, I'd love to hear it, Hassan, but it's a good question, and not really quite sure the best way to answer it. let's look at this is sort of, I guess, elaborating. Maybe this will help. Maybe this will give us a better idea of how to answer that. He says, so when we're talking about originative sources, they're either present in soulless things like the fire we were talking about, the fire, the clay, or they're in things that are possessed of a soul. As far as we know, that's just us. That's for Plato. But for Aristotle, I don't know if we want to get into this too much. Does anybody know this? Aristotle thought that there were three types of souls and that we had all three of them in us. We were like, we had all types of soul. Does anybody know this? I know some of y'all have taken philosophy before. Did y'all cover that? No? Yeah, so he actually thought that plants had souls, okay? And animals had souls, but that they were a lesser form of a soul. So the plant, it was a vegetative soul is what he called it. So they weren't sensual. Plants couldn't sense anything, but they would eat stuff. So they were vegetative, okay? And they would grow. They grow towards an end. A flower would try to blossom. A tree tries to, bloom and be as vibrant a tree as possible. It takes in stuff. And that's the first type of a soul. So there's some movement from itself, the plant. Animals have the animal soul, which for Aristotle, he did not think they could reason. Animals cannot reason. Animals are going completely on instinct. They're going on just their emotions, their instinct. They don't conceptualize. There's no art of house building in an animal. You might say, well, what about beavers? What about possum? Like people that, there's all these animals that build structures and things like that. But for Aristotle, he's going to insist that they do it without reason. They don't do it with knowledge or know-how. They do it out of an instinct. They're just drawn towards this sort of behavior.
But aren't we like by instinct drawn to having shelter as well?
He would say that's a rational. I don't know if he'd use the word instinct, but he would say that that's a rational thing. Humans, animals maybe they find shelter in an instinctual way. I'm not saying he's right about this. I think maybe you've got a pretty good point. But the idea is that being rational is in our nature, and because we're rational, we're able to understand that we can take material and turn it into a building to protect us from the environment. And there's this forethought, there's this preconceived notion of what we need, a telos, an aim, and then we go about doing what whatever project that we have envisioned, and we complete it. He doesn't think that same process goes on, that same process of deliberation goes on in animals, so.
I agree, but I don't know if a house would be a good example, since because a lot of the reasons why we make houses is based on very perceptible dangers. Like we sense the cold, we sense the rain. Same with the construction, building, animal. So maybe something like, I don't know, jewelry or something would be a better example of rational.
Yeah, I maybe he would be, but he doesn't want to limit it to that. He wants to say houses are like they share the same sort of framework. I mean, maybe that makes his metaphysics a bit weaker, but he's going to insist that, look, so maybe he'll admit that some older houses might have not been as good as more modern houses, but he might say when we were first organizing society, and this is another thing about him, he seems to think that humans have always been in societies, that we are political by nature. Not only are we rational by nature, we give reasons, we conceptualize, but we're also political by nature. What that means is that we always gather together with other people. We can't find meaning or purpose outside of the context of a society. And he actually seemed to think that human societies are just as natural as a beehive. So when you look at a beehive, it's organized a certain way because of nature. Same thing with human societies. This is quite similar, if you're familiar with, anybody in here familiar with Confucianism? This idea that, Confucius thought that all these different, what's what I'm looking for, different roles, different titles that you find in society, king and subject, father, son, familial roles, that they are somehow a reflection of a natural order. And so to be a proper and good citizen, you can find analogs in nature. Of course, humans are much more complex than other lower animals, they're going to insist, but there's a certain organization of society. And I think Aristotle's going to say this. And so coming back to the notion of a house, he's going to say, look, I'll give you the, the claim that, houses have gotten better over time, but the first, the earlier houses were still based on this need for shelter, and the need for shelter was there in nature, right? Humans were not built with protective coating from the elements, and so certain materials presented themselves to us. They had certain matter, certain potential. Clay looked like it was good to form, and then we noticed that when it dried, it got hard enough to be a shelter. So maybe we built these clay buildings. After that, we were able to extract metal from the earth, and we found that those structures are more sturdy. But throughout this process, he's going to say there's this progression, and at each step of the way, nature is presenting materials to us that we're rationally reflecting upon. We're going to have these ends, these telos, or an aim that's inherent to us, and all of our activity, all of our aims and our goals are going to be organized around that. And so back to the slide. We need to get to a stopping point here. I just noticed it's already 1:30. Let me read this last quote, and then I'm going to move on to the next slide and see what it says. We might be able to just stop here. So let me see what this says. All arts, for instance, all arts, in other words, all productive forms of knowledge. So all techne, all forms of knowledge that involve producing something are potencies. They're all potentials, right? They're all originative sources, okay? They're originative sources of change in another thing or in the artist himself, considered as other. So let me move on. So potencies are accomplished by a rational form and are capable of contrary effects, okay? So if we're talking about I said form, but formula is the better word. This is where I think Aristotle is going to push back on the Jackson Pollock example. Okay, does Jackson Pollock have a rational formula for bringing forth this work of art? He has knowledge of art. He has knowledge of what it is to be a painter. Jackson Pollock did go to art school, but does he have a conception of his aim before he sets out to paint the canvas? I don't know. That's questionable. I think Aristotle might not consider Pollock an artist. But so what he's saying here is that, and also, this is an interesting point. When we're talking about potency that's accompanied by a rational formula, what it means is that it's capable of what he calls contrary effects. So he says one non-rational power produces one effect. For example, hot is only capable of heating. So if we're talking about a non-rational power, a soulless originative source like fire, or paint or something like this, or clay, it's only capable of doing what's in it, and nothing contrary to itself. Okay, but when we're using our mind, when we're using our soul, we're using art, the notion of artechne, to create something. For Aristotle, that involves both knowing what is good for the thing and how to make it in a correct way, and also how to make it not good. So we, as he puts it, if we're an artist, if we're a doctor, we're able of good and bad effects. And the reason for this, he says, is that science is a rational formula, and the same rational formula explains a thing and its privation. Such sciences must deal with contraries, but with one in virtue of their own nature and with the other not in virtue of their own nature. So in other words, the doctor has to know what's good for health, which is part of the nature of being a good doctor, is understanding the art of medicine, which produces health, but he also has to understand what's contrary to that, what produces deformity, what produces disease. This is similar to a claim that Plato made that we didn't spend a whole lot of time on, but I did have like one slide about it. Remember when Plato said the guardians have to be aware of both good and bad behavior to kind of understand good, you have to understand the bad. Aristotle is saying a similar thing here. right? That the reason that we're able to make bad art and good art is because we're rational and we're able to understand difference, and rationality it entails both, right? So let me see what the next slide says here. We're gonna talk a little bit more about what he means by originative sources. We're gonna get to, I think, hopefully we're gonna get to nature, talking about like the the sort of analogous processes in nature and the processes in creating art, how they're analogous to each other. I don't really know how far we're going to get into it. I don't want to keep us too late. I think last time I kept us almost all the way to the end of class, so I'll try to get us done early today. But let me stop sharing the screen here, and I'm thinking it's 1:35. Why don't we start up again at 1:50? And so you can give you all a full 15-minute break, and we'll probably go on till like 2:30 or 2:40 or something like that. Okay. So I'm pausing the recording right now, and I will see you in about 15 minutes. Does anybody before I start? Does anybody have any comments or questions or confusion? Anything that's come up in the break you want to address about Aristotle? Some of you guys weren't here earlier, so maybe I should say this again about the paper. I'm planning on having the paper topics posted either before or after class next week, and then the due date for the paper will be the following weekend. So the paper, the first essay will be due 2 weeks from today. So that's the story on that. If you already have an idea for a topic that you want to write about, that's fine. Just make sure you clear it with me first. You don't have to use one of the topics that I provide. They're just examples, suggestions. So okay, now that that's on the table, anybody got anything? Any questions, comments, concerns? Looks like I got somebody who just popped into the waiting room. Let me let them in. Okay, I'm not getting anything from anybody, so I guess I'll go ahead and get started. Let me go back to our Aristotle presentation here. So let's back up again, actually, go to the previous slide where we left off. So we're talking about, remember, potencies or the capacity of doing something, and he's talking about a rational potency, okay, that we have in our soul, and what that means is some, that if you're an expert on medicine, you not only know how to heal, but that entails you know how to make sick, right? Make disease. Okay. He says the soul possesses an originative source of movement, for example, and therefore the scientific man can produce contrary effects, right? So if you're scientific, I bet the word science also, this is what's problematic about the Greek, I bet the word science is also techne. So art, science, it's going to have a lot more connotations than the English. So he says that the potency of merely doing a thing or having it done to one is implied in that of doing it or having it done well. But the reverse is not implied in the former, right? The opposite is not the case. So he who does a thing well must also do it, but he who merely does it need not also do it well. This is kind of an obvious point. What is he saying here? He's just saying that, again, if you can do it well, then you can do it. But just because you can do it doesn't mean you can do it well, right? One implies the other, but not a vice versa. Geez, for some reason, again, I can't see the chat box when I have the screen sharing. At least I couldn't a second ago. So somebody says, oh, someone's having trouble hearing me. I hope that's just a individual thing. If you can't hear me, anybody else having trouble hearing me? Doesn't look like it. I think it's just one person. Sorry, who is on? It looks like Nathan. Okay, just kick back in. Okay. Oh, it's like right when I stopped sharing screen, that's when it happened. Yeah, there's a lot of glitches in this Zoom recently. I don't know. Maybe they're getting too many people are using it or something like that. But yeah, again, I can't. I'm trying to keep the chat box open while I'm sharing the screen, and it won't let me do that for some reason. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. All right, well, okay, I think I already made the point of this slide. Let's move on to the next one. See what he says here. Now we're getting to the ethics. Oh, geez, did not mean to go that fast. Okay, now we're getting to the ethics. Okay, now we're starting to get to value here. Now we're getting pretty close to talking specifically about art and not just about nature in general and all these metaphysical points. So we're still a ways off, right? I'm hoping by the end of class today we can get a little bit more relevant to the actual subject matter of the class. But let's read here what he says from book 8 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Which is really, more known as a work of ethics, obviously, than it is of art. But what do we draw from this? He says that, this is very similar to the discussion we had before the break about the different types of what is meant by potency, right? Making versus acting, right? Or sorry, what is it? Sorry. Acting versus being acted upon. Here he's going to distinguish between making and acting. Okay, so things made versus things done. The capacity to make, he says, is different from the capacity to act, and one is not included in the other. He says art, and this is again where I think the Jackson Pollock example might not fit. It might not fit his description here. He says art is identical with a state of capacity to make. Obviously, Pollock could make a painting, but could he make a good painting? I'm not so sure that Aristotle would say yes to that. So it says, again, art is identical with the state of capacity to make, involving a true course of reasoning. All art is concerned with coming into being. In other words, with contriving and considering how something may come into being, which is capable of either being or not being. Right? You didn't have to make that painting, but you decided to go ahead and make it. It didn't have to exist. It wasn't a necessary thing. You brought it forth for some sort of reason, right? You wanted to decorate something. You wanted to use it for something else. It didn't exist before. Now it does. The origin is in the maker, right? He has a concept, an idea, a purpose, a need, a telos in mind, a final cause, and not in the thing made. For art is concerned, right? So it doesn't come out about nature. It doesn't come out just by itself of its own volition. It's created by an artist, right? By some creator. Art is concerned neither with things that are or come into being by necessity, nor with things that do so in accordance with nature. Art is a state concerned with making, involving a true course of reasoning, and lack of art is the contrary, right? It's a state concerned with making, involving a false course of reasoning. Both are concerned with the variable, right? With what can be varied, right? What can be more, what can be less, more beautiful, less beautiful. The artist can use too much red in his painting. He can use too little red in his painting. It's concerned with the variable, right? Something that's changeable and irrational. A rational soul can, I guess, understand and produce or fail to produce. So now we're getting stuff from his biology. That was from his ethics. Now we're drawing from his biology and his theory of nature. This is from book 1 of the Parts of Animals. And by now, this should already be kind of apparent. And again, this is what I don't like about your textbook, all these different translations for the same Greek terms. Now we get final cause. That's the typical translation of the purpose, the function. Why'd you make the darn battle axe? Because you wanted to fight, right? Why'd you make the chair? Because you needed a place to sit. That comes first for Aristotle. That precedes what here is being translated as motor cause. I think in the earlier section, in the translation from metaphysics, whoever translated it called it the moving causes, but here it's called motor cause. I call it efficient cause. That comes second. So the conception, the purpose, I need a freaking house, man. Like, it's going to get really cold in the winter. I guess we can sleep outside during the summer, but I know last year it got cold, and I don't like sleeping under a bunch of, like, twigs and stuff and building all these fires. And, let's just build a structure, right? And then let's go do it. Let's grab the material cause. Let's, actually have some builders that make it happen, right? And that's the motor cause. So the final cause is the reason. It forms the starting point. And this is true not just in works of art, but also in works of nature. This is another one where I think the first is kind of intuitive. Oh yeah, man-made stuff. Yeah, that makes sense. We have a conception, we have an idea in our mind of what we're gonna make, and then we set about and make it. But to say that there's a purpose in nature, this is perhaps not intuitive, especially to us, because we've been kind of taught to see nature not this way. Modern science does not see nature as having an ultimate aim. It just does things. There's processes in nature. Sure, Aristotle's right about that. There's a process, but it's not like the tree is aiming to be a tree. It just is. But he's thinking, no, the tree has a freaking aim, just like the builder has an aim. He says, consider how the physician or how the builder sets about his work. He starts by forming for himself a definite picture. In one case, perceptible to the mind, right? The picture of the building that is to be, and the others of sense, right? So the physician can see, can look at the physical state of his patient and make a diagnosis. Right? So again, I'll start over. He starts by forming for himself a definite picture, in the one case perceptible to the mind, in the other to sense, of his end, his telos, his goal. The physician, health. That's his aim. He wants health. He wants to produce health. The builder wants to make a house. That's his aim. And this he holds forward as the reason and explanation of each subsequent step that he takes and of his acting this or that way, as the case may be. As I said earlier, for Aristotle, everything that exists in the universe has a purpose. It has a function. But not only that, everything we do, every action has a purpose or a function. It's goal-oriented. It's working towards an aim. So you can't understand why somebody does what they do unless you know what they're aiming for. And so in this case, and all the stages that lead up to the final product are subservient. I'm trying to think of a better word, but they rely on that goal, right? The reason that you grab wood and mortar and brick instead of Jello. And I keep saying Jello. I didn't think of a better example. Jello and water, and I mean, there's all sorts of other material that's just not suitable for building a house. Cheese Whiz, whatever. I mean, they make that anymore, right? So you start gathering, and your purpose determines what is needed for the project. So again, each subsequent step, everything I do, acting one way and not another, is all in respect of that final aim, that final goal, that telos. All right, now we're going to get even more abstract. Sorry, I promised you we'd bring it back to art by the end of class. I hope I can fulfill my promise. But now he's going to start talking about the concept of necessity, which is a pretty controversial concept today. I know when I was studying here at UH in grad school, and I took a class in logic. This is still kind of like, modal logic, which deals with necessity, is still a pretty controversial area of philosophy. But how does Aristotle handle this concept of necessity, and what does it have to do with nature? What does it have to do with art? Well, let's see what he has to say. So he says there's two types of necessity. There's, I guess, what you might call necessity proper or absolute necessity, and then there's hypothetical necessity. So what he means by absolute, this is, as he puts it, it's manifested in eternal phenomena. So things that are always the case. The law of non-contradiction, the fact that something cannot be both true and false at the same time. That's just something that's true. You might look at Euclid's, if you know Euclidean geometry, all of you do. You might not know that's what it's called, but you've all been taught Euclidean geometry, the axioms of geometry, right? Parallel lines do not intersect. Those are just true. They're always true, always will be true, and they're necessarily true, just the way the things are defined. Hypothetical, on the other hand, hypothetical necessity, and this is what we're mainly concerned with, and when we're dealing with art, it's manifested in everything that is generated by nature, as in everything produced by art. So something is necessary for a plant, that's a natural thing, because of some other reason. Okay, that's what makes it hypothetical. A plant needs water in order to thrive. It needs to thrive in order to grow and become the best plant. It needs to become a good plant so that we can eat it, right? Because we're even higher than the plant. There's to nourish us or whatever its function is. So he says if a house, he says, or any such final object is to be realized, right? If the thing, the formal cause, what it is going to be realized, it's necessary that such and such material should exist, that the things we need to build it exist, the matter, the material cause, the bricks, the mortar, all that other stuff. And it's necessary that this and then that shall be produced first, and then that set in motion. He's talking here, I would say, about the efficient causes, right? We have to build the foundation first. We can't build the roof before we build the foundation. One step precedes the other out of necessity. This is hypothetical necessity. If we want a building, we have to get this kind of material. If we want to build a building, we have to do this first, and then that, and then we add the plumbing and the electricity at the end, and then we fill in all the other stuff, and so on in continuous succession until the end and final result is reached, for the sake of which each prior thing is produced and exists, right? So the final cause, why we're building it, the purpose for it, in this case, if it's a house, I'm guessing shelter, unless it's like an office building, place to work, it's a government building, place to legislate, to judge, if it's a courthouse. But the final cause, and also in all those cases, you might design it differently. If it's a courthouse, it needs to be wider with wider doors. If it's a small dwelling for an individual family, you need private dwellings for the bedrooms and bathrooms and things like this. So the purpose, the final cause, the function of it guides all the other steps that lead up to it. So when we're dealing with different types of necessity, this is going to manifest itself differently in different sciences, okay? What he calls the theoretical versus the natural sciences. Now, when we talk about the natural sciences, sciences dealing with nature, versus theoretical sciences, or what we might just call philosophy today, or even like abstract mathematics. If you do like super abstract mathematical thought, that's probably what he's talking about here when he refers to theoretical sciences. So he says the starting point of theoretical sciences is that which is. I mentioned a couple examples, right? What is it? The law of non-contradiction. Those just are. They just are true. Okay. Euclid's geometrical. These are theoretical truths. This is kind of what Plato thinks of as all truth. All truth is theoretical in a sense for Plato. It's all the forms, and they never change. Aristotle's like, no, there's a physical world, and we can know stuff about it, and it is changing. Okay, so when we look at the natural sciences, he'll admit that what it deals with is different. It doesn't deal with that which is, but it rather deals with that which is to be, right? That which is going to become, right? Which is everything that exists for Aristotle has a tendency, a proclivity. I forgot who used that word earlier, but I love it, right? Everything has a natural proclivity, and that's just in them, and it wants to be something. Okay, so natural sciences look at that proclivity and study it, right? And mainly look at the final product. What's the end? What is this proclivity aiming for? Why do plants draw nutrients from the soil? Why do humans seek happiness? He says, we have a natural proclivity. There's an end point. And to understand the process that leads up to that end point, we have to know the end point first. To understand the process of the building, why does the builder do what he does in the stages that he does it? You have to understand the purpose. You understand why he's doing it, or else you won't understand all the steps leading up to it. So the same thing, I guess, would apply to works of art. You have to understand what is the purpose of the artist. Why are they making what they're making? To understand the process, why they used the materials they used, why they presented the art in a certain way. Okay, so again, in a sense, the natural sciences would be very similar to the the philosophy of art, theories of art, because art is produced, and it includes things that have a purpose or something which is to be. He says, it is that which is yet to be, for instance, health, let's say, or a man, that owing to its being such and such characters, necessitates the pre-existence of previous production of this and that antecedent. Something had to come first. For a man to exist, there had to be these two parents, a man and a woman that got together and had kids, okay? Nor is it possible to trace back the series of necessary antecedents to a starting point, of which you can say that existing itself from eternity, it's determined their existence as its consequent. Yet he doesn't buy this Adam and Eve story. He says you can keep asking, well, okay, so what created me? Oh, I guess my mom and dad had, they met and they, got married and had kids. Well, what created them? Oh, well, their parents. What, this, he says this keeps going back. You can't go to some originary cause. In fact, even God, for Aristotle, is, it sort of terminates with the deity for Aristotle, but the deity, he's got this interesting notion of the deity. He's very influential, Aristotle is, to early Christians, right? And this is one thing where I think they're going to definitely not like about him, okay? Because he says that God is not a creator in the sense of like, an artist making a pot, like, or a painting or whatever, right? Sculptor making a jar, a artist making a sculpture. It's not that. Like, God is more of he's a final cause. He's not an efficient cause. And so for Aristotle, when you look at all these processes in nature that we've already been kind of describing, right? The tree trying to blossom and be the best, healthiest tree it can be. Humans seeking happiness and trying to flourish and be the best version of themselves they can be. They're all aiming for this perfect state of being, which they can never achieve. They're all aiming for this higher being, which is really God. So the whole universe, all these processes in the universe are aiming for the highest cause, the final cause, which itself is God. And so God is sort of the cause of everything, but doesn't cause anything. In fact, he calls him the prime mover, or sometimes it's translated as the unmoved mover. Everything moves towards this perfect being and tries to be as perfect as it can be. That's what we aim for. That's the telos of all, unified. We all fall short, and God is this separate, perfect entity. In a way, this is somewhat Platonic. It is somewhat similar to Aristotle. I've got a lot of comments. Well, actually, I don't have a lot of comments. It looks like somebody fell asleep on their keyboard and just typed in a bunch of plus signs. So yeah. Wake up, Asim. Don't fall asleep on your keyboard. I know Aristotle can be kind of boring sometimes. I know. I'm just joking. with you. The reason, not the cause, maybe. Oh, you're making a joke. I get it. I'm gonna move on from that. That's a funny joke. Okay. Anyway, so here's where Aristotle completely screws up. And I think he's again, considered one of the greatest philosophers of all time. I'm not saying I would have done any better if I were, living back in ancient Greece. I doubt it. I probably would have come up with a dumber theory of the universe. But this really screws him up. This is where, contemporary biologists look at this stuff and laugh, and they say, what an idiot he was. Because this is pretty much the reverse of how biologists and scientists in general study nature today. So he says, how do we engage in an inquiry? How do we understand nature? He's asking this question: what is the proper subject to begin with? And he divides it up into two. Maybe this is a false dilemma. Maybe there's more options. Maybe there are other ways of looking at all the things that exist in nature. But he says we can either start with the process of formation of each animal. So in other words, we can look at, an embryo, and then a baby, and then maybe a 4-year-old, and then an adult, and then an old, and all these stages. And we can study the process of formation of the animal, or we can look at the character of a given creature once it's already formed. So he says, where should we start? Should we look at the process that leads up to the final goal, or should we look at the final goal to understand the process? And he thinks, and hopefully maybe some of you could probably already answer this given what I've said about Aristotle so far, he wants to start with the goal. We can't understand the process unless we understand what it's moving up towards. So if we want to understand, we want to be a scientist or a biologist and study dogs, we have to understand what is a fully formed adult dog, and we want to pick the most perfect specimen, like the most healthy dog that we can find, the best dog there is, the best in show, right? And then we take that as like sort of the example, and we say, okay, so all dogs are more or less trying to achieve this. And all the things they do, all their behaviors, the way they act is a movement towards that telos, is a movement towards that goal. So all things can be understood in those terms. This is the opposite process, by the way, of evolutionary biology, right? Evolutionary biology assumes there is no goal, unless you want to maybe count survival as a goal, but it's just more of an instinct. And some animals have the capacity for survival given their traits and given the environment that they're in, and some don't. And if you have the right traits, you pass them on. If you don't, you don't. And there's no goal. It's not like humans wanted to be, walk upright. They just happened to. The ones that were walking more upright and could run faster and get to a tree happened to pass those traits on. But for Aristotle, he's a bit of what you might call an essentialist. He thinks that, no, humans did not evolve. All humans throughout time have always been the same, and what a perfect human is has always been the same, and we've always been sort of trying to be this. No one's ever been perfect, but that's what we're trying, right? Somebody said, couldn't we say the goal is survival? I suppose so, but again, scientists don't like to talk about this, at least since they don't like to talk in these terms of goals. It's very anthropomorphic. It gives too much agency to nature, or even to like the animals that are involved. You might say survival is a goal on an individual level. I want to survive, you want to survive, we can't help but want to live. Most of us just have that instinct. We're not gonna, if we see danger, we're gonna try to protect ourselves. We don't have to think about that. So survival would maybe be a part of our proclivity. It's in our nature. But Aristotle would say, yeah, but still, when we step back and see the whole picture, right, you're being very selfish. You're just looking at the individual. There's going to have to be this overarching aim. Why are we all trying to survive? But again, scientists today are going to be like, look, survival is something that's hardwired in us. It's an instinct, sure, but it's not this sort of self-aware, and it's not going towards something. It develops, but it doesn't develop with some sort of preconceived notion in mind. Hassan says, there's evidence all life so far is finding different and more complex ways to resist entropy. This might be helpful, maybe, to Aristotle. I don't know. I have to think about that. He might say that, okay, ultimately, maybe if Aristotle were alive today and we told him all about Darwin and evolutionary biology, he might have a way of responding. He might say, okay, well, there still is a perfect human, and maybe this way of adapting to different environments, if we're able to sort of, each stage in human development includes all those capacities, all those potencies, to use his word, that maybe that's the aim, like the aim of evolution, of human evolution, is to create a I don't know, I hate to use the word because it's so controversial, but like a Superman, like a Nietzschean Ubermensch or something like that. Yeah, it's an interesting idea. But I don't know. He seems to sort of think that it's all set in stone already, right? That like there's a perfect man, like, that's never existed, but there's this sort of archetype, there's this sort of like, I don't know, perfect state that we're all working towards, and every animal has their own version of that. Every plant, every animal is all working towards its natural best, insofar as it thrives. So he says, for elsewhere, as for in the instance of house building, this is the true sequence, right? So we start with the end, with the goal, then we can understand the steps that lead up to it, right? So, this is true of house building. It also should be true of nature, he says. The plan of the house, or the house, has this and that form. Because it has this and that form, its construction is carried out in this and that manner. For the process of evolution is for the sake of the thing finally evolved. It's not for the sake of the process. Okay, so again, this is sort of the reverse order than the one you see in Darwin. So let's see. Teleology, more about teleology. So aims, we remember that word. Teleology is sort of the study, the understanding of nature in terms of aims, everything in terms of a goal or a function. Let's see what he says here. Propagation. This implies a creative seed endowed with certain formative properties. The parent animal pre-exists not only in idea, it's not some platonic form, but actually in time. It is by possession of certain characters by the parent that determines the development of like characters in the child. This is a lot like what he was saying earlier in the metaphysics. Like produces like. Man is made of man. The same statement holds good for all the operations of art, even for those which are apparently spontaneous. For the same result as produced by art may occur spontaneously. Spontaneity, for instance, may bring about the restoration of health. The products of art, however, require the pre-existence of an efficient cause homogeneous with themselves, such as the statuary's art, which must necessarily precede the statue. For this cannot possibly be produced spontaneously. Art indeed consists in the conception of the result to be produced before its realization in the material. Again, I keep coming back to the Jackson Pollock example, but that's a good example. I'm not so sure he would like this, that he would say this is art. Again, in this quote here, art must be produced by some preceding conception in the mind of the artist. He's adding a little here. He's saying, like produces like. So there must be a sort of similar image in the artist's mind as he puts on the canvas. So before the artist painted his portrait, he or she, that they envisioned what it would look like, and then they set out to work on it. And I gotta say, I know when I was younger, I used to draw a lot. I used to be, I guess, a bit of an artist, you could say, right? I still doodle quite a bit, but when I was young, I would draw a lot. So I took art lessons, till I was in high school, and then I just started partying and just didn't do anything creative and just sort of knocked off like some loser. But when I used to draw, one thing that would frustrate me is that I would always have these pictures in my mind of what I wanted to draw, and then I would set out on paper to try to draw it, and I get frustrated because the image I had in my mind would never be what I envisioned on the paper. It would never exactly be what I wanted, what I intended. And so I guess what Aristotle would say is, I lack art. I lack that capacity. If I was a true artist, I would be able to execute this. And that's the ability, I would have to translate. Somebody uses the word translate. Eric says, translating. Yeah, but honestly, I think I was approaching it the wrong way. That's why I got really frustrated with painting. I was a much better, illustrator. I could draw with a pen and ink, but when I actually tried to paint something and get it to be like it was in my mind, it would be even more frustrating. Because I was thinking like Aristotle. I had this conception of art like Aristotle. All art is produced by some image in the artist's mind that is somehow identical or at least close enough to the work of art, and the artist just brings it forth. And it's never executed exactly like I envisioned it, and that would just frustrate the shit out of me, and I would just give up. Maybe that's why I quit drawing a whole lot. I was like, I just can't, I'm not that good at this. Somebody says, are you saying that the goal of life is just to resist entropy? I'm not sure, Christopher, is that addressed at me or some of the previous comments? I'm not saying it is, but if that's the claim being made, right, that all life, I don't think that's the claim that was being made in the comments. I think they were just saying, somebody was saying that that's sort of that somebody said that entropy brings about more complex forms of life, right? The struggle against the elements. Aristotle sounds like a dick. In what way? How does he sound like a dick? I don't think he sounds like a dick. He sounds like kind of I would say his notion of art is very representational, but that's just a product, I think, of his time period. You didn't have abstract art in ancient Greece. You didn't have, you know, Jackson Pollock paintings in ancient Greece. So, but I don't know. I'm kind of curious why you think he's a dick. I mean, I see, but I mean, there's definitely reasons to think that, but I'm not thinking. I can't think of anything I've said so far that would make you come to that. You do not have a heart. Yeah, I guess maybe. Now I guess I see where you're coming from. Yeah, it's a very mechanical approach to art. I guess there's no emotion. But I think that's a misreading of him. I think maybe we haven't got far enough in Aristotle yet. This is where I think he's got a leg up on Plato, actually. And I don't think we're going to have time today because you're getting pretty close to the end of class. But in his defense, I think he's actually he's very much of the view that art must involve heart, for lack of a better word, or emotion, and it's not bad. That's actually a good thing. So I think, that's where he's another reason he'll be different from Plato, is that art, it does touch our soul, and it's a very emotional experience that we have when we engage with really good art. But that's not a fault. That's actually a plus, he would say, for art. He argues for that. But we'll probably have to wait till next class to get into all that stuff. You guys keep talking about entropy and all this stuff, but I feel like, man, we're gonna get really sidetracked with all this stuff about entropy and survival of the fittest and all this stuff. It's interesting, but it's gonna get much more into cosmology, biology, metaphysics, and stuff like that. I'm trying to bring it back to art here, okay? But let's look at some of the examples he uses from nature. I'm running out of time here, so I want to try to get to a good stopping point before I end stuff. Let's read this section from the Physics. This is in page 87 of the textbook. He says, "We do not ascribe to chance or mere coincidence the frequency of rain in winter, but frequent rain in summer we do, nor heat in the dog days, but only if we have it in winter. If then it is agreed that things are either the result of coincidence or for the end, these cannot be the result of coincidence or spontaneity. It follows that they must be for an end, and that such things are all due to nature, which even the champions of the theory which is before us, for example, Empedocles, would agree. Therefore, action for an end is present in things which come to be by nature." Okay, Empedocles, who is being kind of ridiculed here by Aristotle, was actually right. So Empedocles, I don't want to get too much into this because I think it'll bring up all the issues about entropy and stuff and evolution, and not super important to the subject of this class. But Empedocles was kind of like, you might say, like proto-Darwin. He was like the first Darwin that we know of. He seemed to believe that, no, actually, Aristotle, you're wrong. To understand the animals that are living or that exist now, you have to know what formed them. There were processes that formed them. And Aristotle, he seemed to think that evolution was just absurd. He thought that if that's how all the creatures that exist came about, was through evolution, he thought that you would have all kinds of creatures. You would have like 3-horned creatures and 20-horned creatures, and you'd have humans with wings. And he's like, if that's how things develop, then there'd be all sorts of things. But there are obviously certain types. There are bears and there are humans, and they have certain types of things. And dogs are loyal, and they they hunt, and humans are rational, and they think and build. And he just thought, and he was what you call an essentialist. That word was on a previous slide, essentialism. Everything has an essence. There's a right way to be a bear. There's a right way to be a human. And they're just in nature. These types are just in nature, and they don't change. They don't evolve. And so what it is to be a great tree, to be a beautiful cherry tree, is the same today as it was in ancient Greece. What it is to be a good human is the same today as it was in ancient Greece. This is just part of the natural order of things. Right? And that's why, in summer it doesn't rain very much, right? And it's not really hot in the winter. These are things that are out of season. These are things that are, out of order. So there is an order and there is an ordinary. He's very insistent about that. Maybe that is kind of dickheadish too. Maybe that's why y'all are someone said he was a dick earlier. All right, let's see. I'm trying to come to a stopping point. I think maybe this slide or the next one will be a really good stopping point. So let me read the quote here. Let me do 2 more slides, and then I'll open it up for questions and discussion, and we'll have to save the rest of this for next week. So he says, further, where a series has completion, right, where you see the end, where it's done, it's over, all the preceding steps are for the sake of that. This is getting kind of repetitive, so I'll rush through this a bit quickly here. Thus, if a house, for example, had been a thing made by nature, it would have been made in the same way as it is now by art. He's not saying it was made by nature. He's not a Platonist, but he says if it were, it would be made. Things are made a certain way for a certain purpose, and that's just right. It just is. It's just a part of nature. And if things made by nature were also made by art, they would come to be the same way as by nature. Each step in the series is for the sake of the next, and generally art partly completes what nature cannot bring to a finish and partly imitates her. That's another recurring theme. I think this is the first space we see it. I know it's in Plato to a lesser extent, but I don't think we really saw it in our exploration of Plato. But you're going to see this point brought up throughout the semester. Some philosophers agree, some disagree. But the idea that art, good art, is an imitation of nature. That, there's order and beauty in nature. And when you make beautiful art, it somehow reflects that. And Aristotle seems to be saying that that's true to a certain extent, that works of art have a sort of balance in them that are beautiful, just like balance in nature is beautiful. But also work of art does things that nature can't. It finishes, it completes what nature cannot bring to a finish, right? The block of clay, the lump of clay cannot turn itself into a brick. It must be made into a brick. And so all the things that have a purpose, some of them can sort of fulfill their own purpose, like us. We're rational, so we can fulfill our own purpose of our own volition. But other things, they need the assistance of reason to be brought forth and to realize their purpose. So, but this is an interesting point he makes too, which I think is kind of a funny thing to ponder. But he says, if a house were made by nature, it would have the same form. And same thing with the tree. If the tree was made by artists, it would be, so if we had to build trees, we would have to make them the same way. I don't know what the function of the tree is. I guess if you're thinking in human-centric terms, you need trees to sort of filter air and produce oxygen and things for our planet. So they serve that function. But so if we had to build trees, if they weren't something that already occurred, we would have to build them the way they're already built. They'd have to be, so again, this is more, I don't know if you would call it an argument or just sort of this analogous thinking that he thinks is an argument. And he's like, look, they do what they do because they are the way they are. This is all tautology, right? And so it must be just natural. It's just a natural type that's in nature. And if you want to understand what's good or what's bad about something, you have to understand what everything is moving towards, right? If you want to understand what is a tree, you have to understand all the processes that lead up to that tree, right? The seed, right? We've got this little acorn, right, in the ground. It's made up of certain material that gives it certain potential. By itself, it can't do anything. It needs to be planted. It needs to have water to grow. Once that is in place, and then the plant starts to draw nutrients from the soil, the seed, starts to draw nutrients from the soil, starts to sprout. It's a new thing for Aristotle. It's got a new form. Its form has changed, and it has new potential. Now it starts to grow above the surface, and it can start to get sunlight and all these other nutrients. It started to sprout to the surface, and it's this little twig or whatever you want to call it. Eventually, it becomes a tree, right? He's going to say that every step preceding it is the cause, the purpose of the step that goes after, but is somehow subservient, right? That the seed is for the sake of the sprout is for the sake of this little, leaf, and the leaves are for the sake of the bark, and then eventually you get this fully grown tree, and that tree is for the sake of who knows what. Filtering air, being chopped down to build a house. If it's an acorn tree, right, it's an oak tree because it's an acorn seed. Maybe it's good material for building with. Um, so for him, when he talks about the nature of something, that's going to include both the matter and the form, the material it's made out of and what it is. And he says the latter is the end, right? The form, the form of tree is the goal that everything else leads up to, right? All the rest is for the sake of that. The form, he says, is the cause in the sake of, in the sense of that for the sake of which. How this applies to art is not quite obvious, right? But I think hopefully it'll become much clearer when we get to the next class. But we'll talk about how some arts, he's going to say, are subservient to others. So, if, like, for instance, you're making a movie, if you're the director, I guess you're higher up. Okay, the film, I guess, is created for a certain purpose. We'll get into that next week. What is the purpose of the film? What is the purpose of art in general? He still hasn't really told us that yet. Maybe it's to make something beautiful, but why? What's the purpose of that? But all the steps that lead up to the creation of the work of art are subservient to that work. So if I'm the director of the work, I guess I'm like not as important as the work itself. I exist and my work exists for the sake of the work, for the sake of the movie, if I'm the director. But then there's even people below me. There's the cameraman, there's the makeup artists, there's the actors. All of those arts, all of those skills are for the sake of this other higher project, the film itself. And so again, some technes are more important than others, and some are subservient than others. To sort of be the judge of that, we have to understand what the end product is and what the purpose of the end product is, and all the steps leading up to it are, again, like I said, subservient. I hate to keep using that word because it sounds so derogatory. It's not like he's saying it's not important. You can't make a movie without cameras. You can't make a movie without actors. But those actors are doing their job for the film, for the screenwriter, for the director. The director's doing it for his vision. The vision is for the movie. And so there's this sort of hierarchy. He sees this hierarchy everywhere in the universe, by the way. I'm just using the example from art because of the class we're taking, right? But yeah, this, the seed exists for the sprout. The sprout exists for the tree. The tree exists for material for humans to make buildings with. The humans exist for societies to organize together to be just and good and better. And maybe there's an even higher purpose than that is beyond humans, where all our aim is, to approximate perfection, the perfection of God as much as we can. But now we're getting way too metaphysical, and I had us back to art for just a second. So darn me, I better shut up. I think this is a really good place to stop. What I'm going to do next week, I'm going to very briefly recap what we went over today, just give you kind of the super short version of it, kind of overall, Aristotle's metaphysics, and then we'll talk about how this really applies to standards of art. How do you determine whether a piece of art is good or bad? What does this have to do with nature? How does this all relate? And I think even more importantly, especially when understanding Aristotle and his theory of art, why do we make art? What is its telos? What is the function of art? We still haven't really got a good answer for that yet. So that's all for next week. Again, we'll have some paper topics posted either before or after class next week, and you can always come up with your own topic. It's fine with me. Just ask me first. But I'll stick around. It's like 2:37 right now. I'll stick around for a few minutes in case anybody wants to say anything or has any questions or concerns or confusion. Otherwise, you're free to go. Class dismissed. And have a great week. Just finish reading as much of Aristotle as you can. You don't have to read the last section. You can skip that one on music, his theory of music. But we're going to try to finish it all next week. So again, have a good one. Thanks for sticking around. And I'll be here for just a little while longer if you have any questions. So, all right, bye-bye. Looks like everybody's happy, so I'm going to go close it up. Thanks again, guys. See you.